But let's take a look here at our lesson, which is about true treasures. We're starting in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 19. If we have enough discussion, we might actually cut this lesson in half, because this would be a great lesson to try to stop around verse 23 or 24 and finish up. But maybe we'll be able to get through all of it today. Not sure. So let's take a look at the text first of all. This is from Matthew 6, verses 19 through 24. And it says there, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The lamp of the body is the eye. If therefore your eye is good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. And if therefore the light that is in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon." So that's our text for today. And let's just jump into a couple of real basic questions to get started. First of all, first question, all these questions are always on the website. You can download them if you'd like to. I've got the other one finished for next week as well. That'll be out there hopefully next day or so. But first question is this. Jesus makes a simple but clear statement here in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 19 through 21. What are the two options we have concerning where we lay up treasure? We got two basic options here.
Earth or in heaven.
Earth or in heaven. You can either lay up treasures here on earth, you can lay up treasures here, lay up treasures in heaven. Eventually, whatever we put here on earth is going to deteriorate, or we are going to lose it at death. And this is a basic teaching that just grows clearer with age and clearer with experience. What does our choice say about our heart?
It's where your treasure is.
Yeah. Whatever we see people putting the most emphasis on, it tells us where their heart is. If your emphasis is on money and things and material pleasures and sensual pleasures and physical things, then it indicates that your heart is focused on those things. But if your heart is focused on God and serving others and serving God with your material blessings and your life and your things, then it says something about where your heart is. And I think that's really the point of that statement. We can tell where your heart is by telling by knowing where your treasures are. What do you talk about the most? What do you do the most? What are the most important goals in your life? What are you the most focused on? We can tell a lot about where your heart is based upon some of those things. This is a great, I think, starting quote from John Smith, but John says this: "The word treasure is being used in a very broad sense." Okay, we're not just talking about money. I think that's important to note. When he says your treasures, we're not just talking about money. It's being used in a broader sense than that to refer to your basic outlook in life. For instance, what is your goal in life? What's most important to you? What do you want most out of life? From what do you derive your main satisfaction? Where are your ambitions directed? What's first in your life? What do you love above all else? Your answers will not be determined simply on the basis of your verbal responses, but on what your everyday life exposes. And I think that's a great point. So as we take a look at the next question here, and feel free to chime into the chat box. I don't have it open for me. I'm going to designate a chat box reader. So let's see here. Who'd be a good chat box reader? Eric Tustin. If you see somebody comment, do you see a chat box open on your screen?
Yeah, I've got my cell phone, so it's a little small.
Oh, okay. Okay. Maybe you're not a good choice. Sorry. What about, let's see here. Who we got? John, are you a good reader? John, if you had to ask to raise your hand.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay. I was looking at John Bestoso and John Fribbins jumped in, but yeah, John Fribbins. Yeah, if you see something red in the chat box, go ahead and just unmute yourself and read it for us so that I can see my screen. I have it closed down. All right.
You got it.
Thank you, sir. Second question then, what will very possibly happen to our earthly treasures? I mean, what's Jesus say about earthly treasures? Why is it not a good idea to make that your prime investment?
They will soon be gone.
They will soon be gone. That sounded like a Hattie. Yeah, they're soon going to be gone. It's very possible. So he mentions, he makes 3 illustrations, okay? And these illustrations, I do want you to see, would have been pretty applicable to his first century audience. The first thing he mentions, he says moth could destroy, all right? And so in the first century where we have very closed up houses, it's not as easy for bugs and insects to get into our houses as it would have been in the first century, where you have open doorways and sometimes open windows and dirt floors, easier for bugs to enter in. And so a moth could have eaten through your clothing, right? And so they would have understood that, they would have understood having, a piece of clothing ruined by a moth or something like that. But clothing was a standard of wealth in the Bible. What is it that, remember Achan in Joshua chapter 7, he stole a few things from the accursed city, the city of Jericho. One of those things in Joshua 7, verse 21, was he stole a Babylonish garment. His entire family dies as a result of that because he broke God's law, and his family would have known about it too because he hid it in a tent. But he steals a Babylonish garment because that's a picture of wealth. It's an earthly treasure, and it was more important to him than doing God's will. You also see Naaman, who is told, you see Naaman's servant, it was Gehazi. He was told not to take, no, it wasn't Naaman's servant. It was Elisha's servant. And he was told not to take anything from Naaman because Naaman offered a financial reward because he was cleansed of his leprosy. But Gehazi turns around and actually, he actually is willing to take that reward. And one of those rewards is clothing, okay? So, clothing being an earthly treasure is not a new thing for us. It was an earthly treasure back in the Old Testament. It was an earthly treasure in the first century. And Jesus says it's not really a great focus of your investment because a moth could eat through it. And we could say the same thing, we can make a similar point that how many people have spent tons of money on clothes and then a year later, that's not in style anymore, right? And so we don't want to wear it because it's out of style. And yet we've spent hundreds of dollars, thousands of dollars maybe on these things, and they're all out of style. Jesus would say, don't put your emphasis on those things. He says this too. He says, moth can eat through it, but also rust can destroy it, okay? Do you think anybody's earthly treasure is their car? And what can happen to the metal that's all on your car's engine and parts, and
Rust away.
it rusts away, and eventually that's just what happens to physical things. They corrode, they erode, they deteriorate. And Jesus is just making a really simple point here that moth and rust is going to destroy things. Rust literally means eating away, and that could apply in the first century to corn and grain bins that are destroyed by mice and by worms, and not focusing on those earthly treasures as well. And then there's one more thing. There's one more illustration. He says moth, he says rust, and then he talks about thieves. And it says thieves break in, all right? Thieves probably in the first century broke in a little different way than thieves today break in. The word break in actually means dig through. So in the first century, what were the walls made out of in some of those houses, first century homes?
They're made out of a clay or some sort of earth.
Yeah, clay, earth. And so if you wanted to break in somebody's house, you just dug through the wall and you could climb in through it by just digging through it. It's not very easy to dig through stucco or brick, like, things like that, like what our houses are made out of today. And so this is something in the first century they would have been familiar with. This is how robberies, sometimes happened. And he says, look, don't put your investment in earthly things. Now, what kind of illustrations do you think Jesus might use today to speak of the foolishness of living for earthly pleasure?
Wall Street, economic, the country's economic stability.
Okay. Yeah, don't put all your money in the stock market, because don't make your whole life's focus the stock market, because 2008 can hit, where we have the mortgage crisis, or coronavirus, a pandemic can hit the world that drops all of your money. And so if that is your complete focus in life, that could be very earth-shattering for you. What else?
And Josh, I was thinking of, we have so much focus today on celebrities. And these are the folks that from outward appearances seem to have everything that they would need, right? A lot of money, a lot of fame, all that. Yet at the same time, these are the folks that in many cases are miserable. They become addicted to drugs, they get divorced, and in many cases even come to the point of ending their lives out of misery, even though that you would think they have everything that would make them happy.
Great point. Pleasure does not have long-term fulfillment. Earthly pleasure. What else? I'm waiting.
Hey, Josh, this is
Hey.
David.
Hey, David.
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment. I mean, today, when you talk about investments, a lot of times people think about liquidity and risk. And, you think about these two choices, earthly treasures, liquidity wise, are, easily evaporated, through lots of things. It could be fire, it could be, like you said, down stock market, or, it could be stolen. There could be a lot of things that happen. And then there's risk. And, what's the risk of us losing everything we have? We'd like to think it's low, but just look around. It could be high. If you think about, this virus and all kinds of things, there's a lot of risk, health-wise, possession-wise, with, earthly things. And so, we flip that on its, nose a little bit, and, heavenly things are eternal and they don't deteriorate, and the risk is low. It's none. It's, there's no risk with taking that heavenly path and, laying up treasures there. So anyway, just food for thought. We think about investments. We think about those two things with investments, and this is no different.
Good point. It's a good point. It made me think of what you read in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 18. It says, you were not redeemed with corruptible things like silver or gold from your aimless conduct. So he talks about those things being corruptible, but Peter also talks about basically how heaven is incorruptible. Paul talks about incorruptible, immortal, uses words like that, everlasting, and it's really exactly the contrast that Jesus wants us to see. Any investment that we make that is purely earthly, you're going to leave it here. And so invest in things that are eternal in nature and lasting.
Hey, Josh, I got a chat box update.
All right, thanks.
Okay, 3 people have responded since I got on here, and they're talking about, of course, we were just talking about the where your treasure is in heaven from Matthew 6:21. And they're talking, like Michelle Rupp writes here, yeah, I was thinking outside of the big houses and name brand clothes and more pouring into meaningless relationships instead of lasting relationships with brethren.
Mm-hmm.
And Mary Beth Henderson writes, good point, Michelle, in meaningless pursuits. Now, I can relate to that meaningless pursuits thing because I think a lot of times in this country, the media just pursues stuff that really doesn't matter. And then also from Ben says here, I think our job can be this way as well. Not to be morbid, but there are only a handful of people who are affected by our birth and our death. Very few of those people are our coworkers. When we leave a job, we are replaceable. Let's not put all of our effort into and focus into our employment. And then Joni Skinner Pike, there is no luggage rack on the hearse. On a hearse, I think is what she meant to say, but that's a great one. I like that.
Mm-hmm.
So there you go.
Yeah. Yeah. Great point. I've heard it said there's no pockets in a shroud. Right. You're not going to take it with you. And I think Ben made a great point that I actually had a verse reference here. Proverbs 23 and verse 4 says, do not overwork to be rich, because of your own understanding cease. And I think that's a great point, because sometimes we can get so caught up in pleasing the boss, and sometimes about pleasing the boss, it's about making more money. It's about, making sure that everything is perfectly ironed out for our financial future. And sometimes we miss out on important relationships with our family, our spouse, our children, our brothers and sisters in Christ. And those are lasting things. I hope that I'm going to be in heaven. I want to be in heaven with my spouse and my children and my brothers and sisters in Christ. And so I want to put more focus on them if I can. So good thoughts. Appreciate everybody's jumping in there so far. Thank you, John, for reading that to us. Take a look at what Barclay says here on this passage. He says, whether we are buying a suit of clothes or a motor car or a carpet for the floor or a suite of furniture, it is common sense to avoid shoddy goods and to buy the things which have solidity and permanence and craftsmanship wrought into them. And that is exactly what Jesus is saying here. He's telling us to concentrate on the things which will last. Any man whose treasure is in things is bound to lose his treasure. For in things there is no permanence. No thing lasts forever. Don't put your emphasis on things. Okay. Now, we get into Matthew chapter 6, verses 22 and 23. And this is sometimes, in terms of trying to explain it, verses 22 and 23 are two of the tougher verses in this chapter. So he says, the lamp of the body is the eye. If therefore your eye is good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? What are those words about the eye and the lamp and the light, and what does that have to do with the preceding context with regard to our treasures and things, and earthly versus heavenly?
I think it might be saying that what we see is kind of like what we let into our heart, and depending on what we let into our heart and how we use it, it's we might be in darkness or we might be in light.
Okay. Good. What we see.
David saw something that got him in a lot of trouble.
Okay. Okay. Good.
Now, that was his eyes, of course. It was.
Yeah. So David's vision took him a bit off course from God's plan for him, right? And we're not talking about money when we talk about that. And that's a great point. That sets us up for our next question we're going to get into here in a minute. Yeah.
As we read the scriptures, all the way through, we're talking in the New Testament about Jesus Christ. And of course, it says that he's the light of the world, and in him is no darkness at all. So if we're seeing light, we're seeing Christ.
Good. And so, good. Have you ever had a window that was dirty? And how does the light get through?
It's obscured.
Yeah, obscured. Doesn't get through as easily. Or maybe it's not dirty. Maybe you've taken that spray, that look in the wintertime, we spray our windows with the stuff that looks like frost. And so it looks like snow. The light doesn't get through the windows very well when you spray with something like that. And so to me, the idea of this passage is that when we get our focus on earthly and material things, it doesn't let God, like you said, Christ, the light of Christ, into our life as clearly as Christ wants to be in our life. It obscures our vision, our focus, and we don't see him as clearly as we ought to see. So there are things that can distort our spiritual vision. And I believe that material things, earthly treasures, it's one of those things that can distort our spiritual vision. We could talk about other things that distort too. Prejudice distorts our spiritual vision. Jealousy distorts our spiritual vision. Self-conceit distorts our, the Pharisee and the publican. The Pharisee was so focused on how great he was that Jesus points out that he's self-righteous. Double-mindedness is kind of the next point. If a person's got double vision, that's not a good thing. Double-mindedness distorts our vision. A double-minded man, James says, is unstable in all his ways. And so we could go a lot of different directions with that. But I think what Jesus is trying to get us to see is the singular nature of our focus needs to be on spiritual things. Otherwise, we're just not going to be as effective. And that's why verse 24 jumps into this thought of no one can serve two masters. Okay, your eye's not single anymore, it's double. You're focused on two different masters, and you're not going to lead an effective spiritual life being focused on two masters. And so let's get into our next question. Question 4 here.
Before you do that, Josh, I got a chat box update.
Yeah, what you got, John?
Everybody is just about right on point. Everybody's about saying the same thing of watching what we see. And, our judgment is distorted. Michelle Rupp writes here, our judgment is distorted. Our spiritual discernment will be affected. But, mixing light and darkness from Sarah Budd and family to everyone. Mixing light and darkness, meaning exposing our hearts to more than light. We cause war within us. We can't think pure holiness. I mean, I know there's more here, but those are just a couple that I saw that just jumped out at me right out of the gate.
Okay.
So.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it. All right. So let's see here. We'll go ahead and read this quote from Garvey. He says, the meaning is this. It's to be ascertained from the context, all right? The subject under consideration is the propriety of laying up treasures not on earth, but in heaven, and the effect which treasures have upon the heart. The heart, or the affection, is to the soul much the same as the eye is to the body. If we do not set our affections upon spiritual things, the time quickly comes when we cannot see them. And Jesus therefore represents our affections as if they were an eye. If the eye is single, if it sees nothing with a double or confused vision, then the man receives through it clear views of the outside world, and his inner man is, so to speak, full of light. But if his eye is diseased, if it is blinded, then his inner man is likewise darkened. So if you apply the allegory to the spiritual man, if his heart is single in its love toward God and the things of God, then he has clear views as to the relative importance and value of things temporal and eternal, things earthly and things heavenly. But if the heart looks with a double interest upon earthly and heavenly treasure, it makes the man double-minded and it spoils his life. God does not permit a double affection any more than he does a double service. And a man who seeks to continue in it will soon be visited with great darkness as to the things of God, and will become blind in heart, blind in conscience. So I think that's well said. Now, as you think back through, I want to kind of use this particular point to just do a quick review of what we've really studied in the Sermon on the Mount so far. What kind of earthly treasures might Jesus be referring to besides money? As you think through, Matthew 5 and 6 up to this point. What are some things that people can treasure besides just money? It's an earthly treasure.
Their clothes are like just material items.
Okay. Their clothes or material items. And in fact, in the following context, we're going to see a little bit of that. He says, don't worry so much about what you wear, about what you eat, about what you drink. And so we're actually going to get into that a little bit more. Those are earthly things, though, in material things. I want you to think back to our lesson, which I think this was 2 lessons ago. We talked about, this was kind of what I called our soap opera lesson, right? We talked about anger, we talked about lust, and we talked about dishonesty, okay? And so we can treasure anger over reconciling with our brethren. We can treasure lust over the purity and the beauty and value of marriage. And John Bastoso mentioned David lusting after Bathsheba. That's an earthly treasure. Anger and hatred towards another is an earthly treasure. It's a sensual treasure. Lust is that as well. And then there's also dishonesty. Sometimes we're dishonest because, or we're not very truthful because we're trying to somehow, get our way or persuade somebody to one thing or another. But that's what Matthew 5 talks about: anger, lust, and dishonesty. And then it talks about vengeance. These are all earthly treasures. And then we get into Matthew 6, and we talked about giving and how some people give publicly because they want to be patted on the back. We talked about prayer, and some people pray like the hypocrites. So they make a big show of it because they want to be patted on the back. And some people fast very publicly because they want other people to see them doing that. And so their motives are wrong. Those evil motives are earthly treasures. That lust, the anger, the hatred, the vengeance, these are earthly things. And so what I'm trying to do is get our mind wrapped around the fact that earthly treasures are not just money. It includes money, it includes things, it includes materialism, but it includes these other things that Jesus has talked about as well in the Sermon on the Mount so far. All right, so
Josh.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Michelle Rupp has something here that just what you just went over and talking about other examples of not quickly making peace with brethren. Now, I've got to tell you, I love that example. Why she thought of it, that's great. But she also put on your sexual sin, anger, resentment toward our enemies. And so treasuring our choice to be stubborn and submit to God in these things. She is so right. And what you went over is basically what she said.
Okay, good. Anything else, John? That's it.
No, not at this point.
Okay, sounds good. Well, thank you. All right, there's a part B to this question, and that is this: what does Jesus pointedly say about those who try to serve 2 masters? Okay, so the person that tries to serve God and yet harbors his anger and bitterness and hatred, the person who tries to serve God and yet is lusting after those that they're not married to, the person that serves God but is still not truthful like God is and is dishonest. What does Jesus say? Can we do both of those things?
No.
No.
You're going to love one and hate the other one.
Yeah. Now I want us to wrap our minds around this comparison here, because he's comparing this to a slave-master relationship. And I'm not sure we really think about that deeply enough because we're just not in that culture today. We are, if we have a employer-employee relationship, a lot of times, we're told to work our 40 hours or sometimes more or less. But then we get to go home and we get to enjoy ourselves. And we get to do whatever we want to do with the rest of our time. But that's not how it is with a slave-master relationship. Okay, and in a slave-master relationship in the first century and before that, a slave wasn't like an employee. It's not the same thing. He's at the master's disposal. He didn't work 40 hours and then did whatever he wanted the rest of the time. A slave belongs all day, day in, day out, to his master. And Jesus is comparing us to a slave. Now, not in a negative sense. It's not like God, beats us and chastens us, or there's any of those negative, connotations or aspects here. But we belong to God, just like the slave belonged to his master. In that context, we belong to God. And therefore, our thinking is always, every day, all the time, is this something that God wants me to do? Is this something that God wants me to be saying? Am I putting my focus where God would want me to have my focus right now? And when we think that we can compartmentalize God, like, well, I went to church on Sunday and I there's my God time, but I can do whatever I want the rest of the time, then we don't get it. We're doing exactly what Jesus says you can't do. You can't serve God. You can't be his master and then be your own master the rest of the time. Can't compartmentalize it. We are God's all the time. And so our thinking needs to be, what can we do in our everyday situations so that what we're doing is pleasing to God. Does that make sense? All right. Let's take a look here at the next thought. And that's in verses 25 through 29. I see, looks like somebody's popped into the chat box. I'll pull this up, John. Sarah just says, absolutely, Josh. All right, Sarah, thanks for that. And it looks like there was a couple other things here. Carissa had said that bad vision elicits moral corruption. Seth had talked about possessions being things that corrupt us. Katrina talked about power. So those are all good thoughts, good comments. Appreciate it. I just don't think there's enough time to cover verses 25 through 34 adequately. So I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to call an audible here, and I'm going to split up this lesson in half. We actually had an extra lesson at the end anyway, and I would rather take more time focusing on verses 25 through 34. There's a lot of good stuff in here rather than rush through it here in the next 15 minutes. And so I'm going to do that now. Before we do that, is there anything else that you guys want to add to this lesson here today? Anything from Matthew 6, verses 19 through 24 that you'd add?
Hey, Josh.
Yeah.
In John chapter 8, we're told that whoever is in sin happens to be a slave of that sin. So we can be a slave just means that there's somebody mastering us or taking us over in whatever the situation or the meaning is. If we're a slave to Christ, then we're going to live as Christ.
Right.
We'll be a servant.
Good thought. Good thought. We are a slave to one or the other. And the book of Romans uses that same type of thinking as well. It says you were slaves of sin. Romans 6, verse 17. God be thanked that though you were slaves of sin, yet you obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine to which you were delivered, and having been set free from sin, you became slaves of righteousness. And so God wants us to be servants of righteousness. In fact, I'm going to back up to Romans 6 a little bit more and just kind of maybe conclude with these thoughts. It says in verse 13, do not present your members, that's your body parts, okay? Do not present your members as instruments of unrighteousness to sin, but present yourselves to God as being alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness to God, okay? So my hands, my feet, my eyes, my ears, my mouth, all of my body parts, I'm using my physical body to serve God. I'm using my feet to go preach the gospel. I'm using my tongue to praise him and to edify others. I want to use my ears, and I want to hear things that edify and that strengthen me spiritually. I want my eyes focused on things that are right in his sight. I want to use my hands to do good for him, to provide for my family, to help other people when I can, to serve him. And so how can we present our members, our body, to glorify God is a key part of being his everyday, all day servant. All right. I saw a couple comments, it looks like, popped in into the chat box too. So I'll read those and then we'll finish up. Sarah said, Ben's comment above is so powerful. Not sure if everyone saw that. So let me scroll up. Ben says this, I think it's a metaphor. He's talking about our eye. And this is Elaine. It says at the end. So sorry, Ben, you're losing credit now. This is Elaine. We'll give credit to Elaine on this. But I think it's a metaphor for our perspective, whether it's spiritual or physical. Maybe it's not meant this way, but I also think it could be interpreted not to view ourselves and others just by physical standards of beauty, the size, shape, and colors of our body. It's very easy, especially as women, to view our bodies and appearances as an earthly treasure. I think that's a great point too. I think that's a great point. Covetousness is not just other things. Sometimes it's how we want to make ourselves. Sometimes we become the idol, not just other things. We become the idol, especially in a humanistic society. So that makes good sense. Joni says this 2020 vision is what we need to have spiritually, not near or farsighted or double-minded. That sounds like a good sermon outline there, Joni. So I might have to use that. And Sarah said, sorry, Elaine, now that Josh read it aloud, I see clearly it was from a woman. Okay. All right. Well, guys, thank you so much for your comments and for your thoughts tonight. Like I said, I will just encourage you to take this lesson that you've got, and now that you've got it, just use it next week too. Now you don't have to print another one, and whatever comes out this week, we'll redate it for the following week, and we'll get back on track that way. All right. Any more thoughts? Anything we need to add? I'm going to close with a prayer if nobody has anything else. All right.
I just want to appreciate that Sarah said that she sees clearly now that it's Elaine. I think it's a little punny. Appreciate that.
All right. Thanks, Jake. All right.